let me introduce our main speaker today, and that's Dr. Stephanie Green. Dr. Green comes all the way down from Victoria in Canada, and she is, I guess, having had dinner with her last night, I can say a fascinating person to start with. But her career has been interesting. She's for several years worked as in general practice, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her career. But she worked as a general practice physician, and relatively recently came to change her focus to end-of-life issues, and she has become just a major force in end-of-life issues in Canada, and she is currently president and co-founder of the Canadian Association for MAID Assessors and Providers. Now, what that means is what she's going to tell you about, because I know what it means, but to say it in one mouthful is not easy. But in any case, she's going to tell you what that means, and she's going to tell you about her background. And then most importantly, she's going to tell you what they're doing in Canada. As you will see when you listen to her talk, or you'll hear when you listen to her talk, she is going to tell us about a real revolution in the way people die that's going on in Canada today. It's a fascinating revolution, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to start thinking about how to move ourselves in that direction down here. And she's going to tell you all about that. So without any further introduction, I'll let her tell you the story.
Hello. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Hemlock Society for bringing me down to the area. It's my first time in Southern California, and it is absolutely beautiful here. This is my second morning. I got to walk the little coastal walk in La Jolla and smell your fabulous sea lions, and it was great. I just loved it. Despite the smell, I really like it. I really like it here, actually. So thank you again, Faye and the Hemlock Society, for inviting me. It's a pleasure, really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to just start by saying the obvious, I hope. We're not here today to discuss the morality of assisted dying. I'm not an ethicist. I am not a philosopher. Mike, I'll get closer to the mic. Yes, okay. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not here to discuss the morality of assisted dying. I am a clinician. I'm here to tell you about my experience working in assisted dying for the last 3.5 years in Canada, and hopefully share some information, some knowledge with you. And we're going to build in a lot of time for question and answer at the end, so hopefully this will be a two-way street. I'm happy to do that. Also, I'm going to start by telling you the two things that I tell every single new patient that I meet. Number one, I'm going to speak very directly about the topic. I'm going to speak about death today. I'm going to speak about dying, and I'm going to speak about assisted dying, and I'm going to call it that. I'm not going to talk in euphemisms or talk about passing over meadows. So I think I'm probably not going to offend this crowd, I think, if I do that, hopefully. The other thing I let people know when I meet them first is that I know that I'm a fast talker, so I'm sorry about that. It's by where I grew up in the East Coast. I think I've lived on the West Coast now for 17 years. I think I've slowed down enough. But if I get really excited about something, whoop, out it goes. So if I start going too fast, I will not be offended if someone says, hey, you're going too fast. You can do that as well. I'm planning to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, hopefully keeping your attention the whole time. And then I'm going to have lots and lots of time for question and answers. That's kind of how I want to set up the day. Every time I do that, that means I need a new slide. They won't let me control the slides, so Barry and I will have this relationship while we're doing this. I'm only going to spend a minute or so about myself. You've already heard a little bit about me, but just why it is that I'm actually able to stand here and talk to you today. I am trained as a family physician in Canada. For 10 years, I practiced what we like to call cradle-to-grave medicine, full-spectrum family practice. I always had a particular interest in newborn care, maternity and newborn care. So I did about 50% of my practice was that in those first 10 years. And for the next 12 or 13 years, I decided to focus exclusively on maternity and newborn care, which I had a real passion for, and I was one of the happiest doctors that I knew. I really loved my work. But when our law changed in 2016, I pivoted and changed my focus to work at the other end. And since June of 2016, I now work almost exclusively in assisted dying. I'd say 90% of my practice is assisted dying. And in that capacity, and because of where I work and where I live, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later, I have spoken with over 350 people about the possibility of an assisted death. And I've had the absolute privilege to help over 160 people to end their life at this point. And I really did love delivering babies, and I still miss those little ones. But I have to tell you that my work in the past 3.5 years has probably been some of the most rewarding work of my career. And if we have time and interest later, I'm happy to talk about my personal experience if there's interest in that. So what I'd like to cover today is a lot. I do think it's important, before we get into the detail of what's happening in California and what may be different and how you might be wanting to focus your energies, I think it's important to contextualize what we're talking about, to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So I will briefly talk about some terminology, some Canadian context. I will go through the Canadian law with you because it's important you understand a couple details of how we got there in order to have the richer conversation later. So you'll allow me to do that, I hope. And then we'll go on to talk about a little bit about the data, about my organization, some of the issues that are still going on, and then we'll take lots and lots of questions. So that's kind of my plan. That is the goal. Keep my finger up there once in a while. So to make sure we're all on the same page, depending what you read, and depending who wrote it, and depending what year it was published, there is a lot of different terminology out there about end-of-life care. So I want to make sure we're talking about the same things. We don't use the term assisted suicide in Canada very much, but I know we do here in the US. So when I'm talking about an assisted suicide, what I might call a self-administered death, what that means is that the clinician has actually prescribed a medication that they have then given to a competent adult who has requested that, and they've administered it and the patient dies. So in Canada, what that means is I will see a patient, I will assess them for eligibility for assisted dying, I will find them eligible, I will write the prescription, I will go to the pharmacy and pick up the medication, I will take it to the patient and hand deliver it, and I will stand by while they take it and ensure that it's done properly and completely. And that is what we would call an assisted suicide, or what we actually call a self-administered made death, an assisted death. The other type of terminology that's often used is voluntary euthanasia, or what I would call a clinician-administered assisted death. And that is actually the administration of that lethal medication by the clinician. So in Canada, what that means for me is I see the patient, I assess them as eligible, I write the prescription. I go to the pharmacy and pick it up, and I go to the patient wherever they are, and I physically push the medication through the intravenous that causes their death. And these are, of course, competent adults who have expressly made this request. So the real difference is simply who administers the medication. That's really the only difference. But it's important that you know that in Canada, we have both of these options, which is not the same here. And we actually have an umbrella term for the entire thing, which we call medical assistance in dying, which I will from now on call MAID, because it's a lot easier to say. And when I talk about MAID, I'm talking about either one of those options, and in Canada, it must legally be done by a physician, an MD, or a nurse practitioner. And I'm pretty sure we're the only jurisdiction in the world where nurse practitioners are able to do this. So any combination or permutation of those four things is MAID in Canada. Okay, so we're all on the same page? Yes, good. Because we have all of these combinations, we have joined a very exclusive club, globally speaking, and there are only a total of 3 other jurisdictions in the world where all of this is possible. You will not be surprised to know they are the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, that nobody ever talks about because there's maybe a dozen people that live there. So we're the 4th jurisdiction. Everywhere else in the world, everything you read about in novels, everything you see in film and hear in the newspaper, everywhere in Switzerland, all the states, in the United States, they're all assisted suicide only. There is no other clinician-administered assisted dying, except actually in Colombia, they have that. They actually don't have assisted suicide, they have voluntary euthanasia, but it's very complicated what's going on down there. It's almost not being done, so we're not going to focus on that. So it's very, very small. I do have to keep updating my slide for all the different US states that keep dropping into there, so that's kind of exciting. And now, of course, in Australia, we have one state that also allows assisted suicide, and there's other states in Australia that are now considering it. So that's our exclusive club. Every time I speak outside of the boundaries of Canada, I like to show a world map so that people know where Canada is. I'd like to think everyone in this room knows where that is. We're those neighbors to the north. You can go ahead and click. But we are actually a very large country. Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, and we are physically larger than the U.S. And this is important, and I wanted to mention this to you because there's 3 things about Canada and our context that's important to keep in mind as we go forward and talk about assisted dying. So I just want to make those things clear. You will not be surprised to know that we have a policy of universal health care. This is probably not news to you. That means we have health care that's paid for by our federal government, of course, and it means that Canadians have an expectation of fair and equitable access to both basic and essential health care in our country. And this now includes assisted dying, which is a fully covered medical service in Canada. Okay, so that's amazing, right? So you need to know that. Number 2, sorry, I was psych. Number 2. We have something called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is a constitutional document that was developed and put into effect in 1982, so not that long ago. And this document is actually a document that outlines the fundamental rights and freedoms of all citizens. And it includes the right to life and of liberty and to security of person and not to be discriminated. But what's important about this is that it's because of this document that someone was able to challenge the law in Canada, the criminal code, which had a blanket criminalization of assisted dying. It's because of this constitutional document that we were able to challenge that. So you need to know that this document exists. And I'm going to explain a little bit more how we got to this place a little bit later. Okay? The other thing that's important to understand in Canada is we have a very special type of federalism, so that our criminal code is national, it's federal. So up until very recently, it was simply a criminal act to assist someone to die. As we say in Quebec, point final, no questions. But what's important to understand is that healthcare in Canada, although is universally accessible and paid for, is administered provincially. So how each province decides to roll that out and administer it can actually be quite different from province to province, although they have the same rules and it's all covered. So for example, I live in British Columbia currently, which is the far side over there. Lovely, absolutely beautiful. And I actually live in Victoria, which is not Vancouver. So the island west of the mainland, the big island at the bottom, is confusingly called Vancouver Island. Has nothing to do with Vancouver. And at the tip, I live in Victoria. And just so you have your bearings, for those of you who don't know, Victoria is about a 30-minute hydroplane ride from downtown Victoria to downtown Seattle. We're basically neighbors with Seattle. Lovely. But where I work in British Columbia, there's a provincial law that says if I help someone to die, when I fill out their medical certificate of death, I have to write as the number 1 cause of death, medical assistance in dying. No problem. Secondary cause of death is their underlying illness. We'll say pancreatic cancer. Okay. My colleagues in Saskatchewan, that nobody's ever heard of, but people are very nice in Saskatchewan, although there's only 6 of them there. Up until very recently, so actually it was earlier in 2019, so the first 2.5 years, by provincial law, if someone were to be assisted to die under the exact same program, it was provincial law that you had to write the number 1 cause as suicide. And you can imagine that the patient and the family had a different reaction to that than what's happening in British Columbia. And then the secondary cause would be the underlying illness. And in Ontario, which many of you, of course, are familiar with, a very large province, they actually passed a law in their province, so it was against the law to write either medical assistance in dying or suicide, but in an effort to protect the patient and the family and the physician, you could only write the underlying illness as the number 1 cause of death. Some might argue that's better. Anyways, the point is, they're all different. And so when we're trying to compare data or trying to do research, we can't just pull the death certificates and compare because it's apples and oranges all of a sudden, even though it's the same care. So there's lots of different differences that I could go through, but I'm not going to bore you with those. So important to know that exists. I would say also, the other thing that's important to understand about the Canadian system, which I'll maybe harp upon later, is that, well, maybe I'll harp upon it later. It makes more sense. That makes more sense. We'll go one more. Yes, thank you. Yeah, exactly. I think we'll move on. So rather than give you the entire story of how we got here, I do want to contextualize how we got to the place that we are in Canada so we can compare and contrast to what's happening here and in other places. So it was not until 1972 that suicide became a decriminalized act in Canada. So it's fairly recent. And up until that point, it was a criminal act to kill yourself. 20 years later, many of you are familiar with the name Sue Rodriguez. Sue Rodriguez was a young woman who was in her early 40s. She happened to come from Victoria, BC, by coincidence. And she was diagnosed with ALS, often known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Many of you are familiar with this. It's a neurodegenerative disorder that will ultimately be fatal. And Sue felt very strongly that she didn't want her illness to decide how and when she would die, that she wanted to have some control over that. And she understood that her illness would rob her of the ability to really have the functional ability to do that herself. She felt it was very important that she would be able to ask a physician to help her to do that. And she felt it was her right to do so. So she challenged the blanket ban on assisted dying. And she took that challenge to the courts, and it worked its way up through our entire system up until the Supreme Court of Canada, which is our highest court, of course. There are 9 justices that sit on that bench. And in 1993, she lost that case. She lost in a split decision 5-4. It was close, but not close enough. So she was very upset about that. And 4 months later, Sue Rodriguez took her own life with the help of an anonymous doctor, who to this day we still don't know who that is. This was investigated, but no charges were ever laid. Then what really happened, I mean, the biggest outcome of this case, which we all followed very carefully in our country, is that it sparked a national debate. There was a lot of support for her and what she wanted to do, and people started talking about this issue across the country. And lots of political things happened we don't need to go through. But in 20 more years, there was a very similar case. So 2 other women, one of them is Gloria Taylor. She's in the picture closest to me. A 61-year-old woman with the same diagnosis, who had the same issue, who wanted to challenge the same law, was joined by Kay Carter in the other corner. And interesting, Kay Carter did not have what you might consider a terminal illness. She had what we call spinal stenosis. And it was progressive, and it was causing her intolerable pain and suffering. And in fact, Kay Carter did not want to wait for the outcome of this court case, and she went to Switzerland and had an assisted death before this case was heard. And her daughter joined the case as a co-plaintiff, and they joined together with a group called the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association to challenge the exact same law that Sue Rodriguez did. Very, very similar. And it went through the court system again and went right up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And this time, 20 years later, of the 9 justices who sit on the panel, it was a unanimous decision. All 9 judges agreed it was unconstitutional for her to not be allowed to have this care, and they all actually physically signed the decision. It was a real legacy decision. It was a very important decision in our country. And so I have this big black box because I often speak to audiences that are maybe less informed than you. And what I'd like to say is, up until this court decision, assisted dying was in a big black box. It's criminal. But what happened with this court decision is that they carved out the very special situations when, if these criteria were met, it would not be a criminal act to assist someone to die. In fact, if they asked for it and someone did help them to die, it had to be legal because, I'm not saying this well, because they had the right to make that request, and to not have that right to make the request was infringing on their constitutional rights. This became a human rights issue, and it was patient-centered. So what's really important, we can do one more slide. So it carved out this area, and we call this the Carter decision, based on Kay Carter. So we call this the Carter criteria. And so they said the 4 Carter criteria, which we don't have to dwell on, are that you have a competent adult who has a grievous and irremediable condition and who is suffering intolerably. And those are the only conditions. That's all that had to be met. This is quite, detailed, but not too specific. And what's interesting about this, and really unique, I think globally, is that this is based on patient suffering. This is not an end-of-life bubble. This is based on patient rights and patient suffering. And so, by example, in the Netherlands, it's really about the law change there was because of a physician conflict in their duties. Physicians were finding they were needing to preserve life and help people. They were also supposed to reduce suffering in their patients. And they had patients who were dying and asking to die, and they couldn't help them. They wanted to reduce suffering, but they were supposed to preserve life. They had this conflict, a professional conflict. And so the law in the Netherlands changed so that the physicians would be able to go ahead and help a patient to satisfy that tension. And it's worded that way. So it's about, the people need to meet certain due criteria, so that it's all physician-based. But in Canada, it's patient-based. And what grows out of that system, of course, is very different than when it's physician or society-based. So I just wanted to explain that. We'll go one more. Now, what the courts did, the Supreme Court then said, okay, in these specific criteria, it's no longer illegal to help someone to die. So maybe we're going to want some laws around that. So they suggested politely to the government that they regulate that and create legislation. Now, they don't have the power to say you must do that, but it was a strong suggestion that government then legislate. And they actually said, this won't come into effect for 12 months. Why don't you go and regulate that practice? And the government at the time did absolutely nothing about it. We had a national election. They got booted out. Somebody new came in. And the new government said, whoa, we're not ready. We need an extension before we can do this. And the Supreme Court said, no. We'll give you 4 extra months. Yada, yada, yada. Politics. On June 17th of 2016, that's 16 months after the court decision, we had a new law called Bill C-14. And that law is, that little green pentagon is specifically smaller than the blue box in which it's in because the legislation was more restrictive than the Carter criteria. Okay? And immediately that caused some tension. And in fact, Bill C-14 was written as an end-of-life legislation, not based on patient suffering, necessarily. So important to understand that as well. Okay? Now, so far, we're still with me? I haven't confused you? Okay, great. So, with all of that understanding, let's talk a little bit more about what's actually going on in Canada. One more. So, if you ask Health Canada how many people have received an assisted death in Canada since June 17th of 2016, they will pick an arbitrary date of October 31st, 2018, which is 2 years and 4 months after the law changed for some reason. And they'll tell you 6,749 people have had an assisted death in our country. They'll also tell you that they've admittedly left out some of the smaller regions of the country where the numbers are smaller and there might be some privacy issues, so they're not included. And they'll also admit that about 6 months' worth of data from Quebec, which is one of our largest provinces and has actually been doing assisted dying even longer than the rest of the country, is also not included. So this is an admittedly lowball kind of number and not so accurate. That wasn't very, satisfying to me. So I called my friends. I've got lots of friends across the country now that do this work. And these are the people that collect that data and report it to Health Canada. So I called them up at the end of 2018. I said, so what of your province? What do you do? And so they just told me what's been going on, and I just tallied the numbers up. And I am personally aware of over 7,900 deaths by the end of 2018. So that's 2.5 years since our law passed. We're now 11 months into 2019. I'm quite confident when I tell you there's been significantly more than 10,000 assisted deaths in Canada to this point, but we won't have the official numbers till this spring. So that's kind of what's going on. What I want to show you, though, is that despite that little bar at the bottom, I think you get the point, is that in every region of our country, each different colored bar represents 6 months after the law has changed. And in every 6-month period, we're seeing an increase in the demand and increase in receiving of an assisted death in every region of our country. And it has not yet leveled off. So it's continuing to grow everywhere. And in fact, even so across the country, the last set of bars is the Canadian average. One more. And what I want to also show you is that if we just look at the raw data from 2018, that's the stuff that I collected from my friends, not from Health Canada, and we see that in every different province there's a different amount of assisted dying happening. The blue bars represent the total numbers in that province or region. And of course, our populous provinces, Ontario and Quebec, of course, have more people and they're having more MAID deaths. There's a lot going on in British Columbia as well, it seems, by the blue bar. But the populations in each region are widely different. So I wanted to find a way to compare them on a more equal level. So I switched the data to the little green bars. And the little green bars are actually the number of MAID deaths in the region as a percentage of all annual deaths. Does that make sense? Yep. And you can see they're a little bit more even across the country. And then, to make sure nobody was asleep, I did something else. I switched the color. And now they're blue again. But this is still the percentage of MAID happening as a percentage of all deaths across the country. So you can see it a little bit easier. And now we can compare it to other jurisdictions, because this is the statistic that most places use to compare how they're doing. Okay? And we can see the Canada number in the middle. By the end of 2018, I can tell you that 1.5% of all deaths in Canada at the end of 2018 were by an assisted death. So not staggeringly high, but not minuscule either. Right? That's a significant number for someone. This is only 2.5 years after our law changed. We see that something in particular is going on in British Columbia. That's the higher bar off to the left there. But now we can compare to other jurisdictions. So we see Oregon. I'm sorry, I don't have California's data up here. It's very, very new. I did recently get the California data from 2017, and if I calculate it out, it's very hard to get annual deaths in California. It's not easily attainable online. You have to add up all these other things. Anyways, my best guess is about 0.1.5%. It's very, very small. So I don't have that. But in another year or two, I'll get California on my slide, I promise. But if we look at Oregon, where they've been doing this for about 20 years, they're doing about 0.4% of all their annual deaths by assisted dying. And I personally think that's probably because they don't have clinician-administered death. I think that's one of the factors. We see, of course, that there's much more going on in the Netherlands. Not surprising. Been 20 years. They've got all the options available. And the Netherlands, the Dutch data is at about 4.4% of all their annual deaths in the Netherlands are by assisted dying. I'm not going to talk to you about Belgium because there's a big controversy about what their numbers really are, and you don't need to know all that. But I do want to tell you about the last couple bars because I find them really interesting. Those last 3 or 4 bars on the slide there, IH stands for Island Health. So that island that I live on Vancouver Island, is on one piece of British Columbia. So if the Canadian average is 1.5% of all deaths by assisted dying, British Columbia's average is 2.5%. And in British Columbia, the engine is coming from Vancouver Island. On Vancouver Island, the engine is coming from the city of Victoria, where I happen to work and live. Island Health is the health authority that administers health just on the island. It's a closed system of about 800,000 people. We're under 1 million people. And 6 months after the law changed, less than a year, already 2% of all the deaths on the island were by assisted dying. 1 year after the law changed, it was 3%. 18 months later, it was 4%. I have access to the 2019 data to date. If I look only at 2019, currently in Victoria, 7% of all expected annual deaths are by assisted dying. So something unique is happening where I am. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, what's happening, we're going to go a little bit quicker, just so you know, across the country, it's basically even, male, female. It's not a particular change anywhere. In terms of age, there's a wide variety. This is an old slide. This is a scatter plot that's supposed to show you all the wide variety. That number of the average has not really changed in 3 years. It started off at 73. It was the average age of someone receiving an assisted death. It's crept up slowly to 74, but it hasn't really changed. The youngest person that I have personally assisted is 29. The oldest person I've personally assisted is 105, and everything in between. So it's really very, very wide. The underlying diagnosis, we're not surprised. We expected the number one underlying condition to be terminal cancer, and it is almost 65%. We thought the next most common diagnosis would be something neurological like ALS, but it turns out it's actually end-stage organ failure, and we lump those together. So I'm talking about end-stage heart disease, end-stage lung disease, end-stage liver failure, grouped together as end-stage organ failure, basically. And that's the next most common cause for requests and provision of MAID, and then followed by neurological conditions, so mostly progressive neurological degenerative diseases. Go ahead. Where is this happening? I like to say everywhere that's safe and legal. In many provinces, the majority is at home. That's certainly true in British Columbia and in Manitoba. In some provinces, it's actually more commonly done in the hospital system. And I think that that's mostly because there haven't been, in the early days, a lot of providers willing to do the work in the community. So hospital systems kind of took up the mantle and created infrastructure to support this program, and now a lot of people are in hospital for that. So it depends where you live, but it's happening almost evenly, average home or hospital. We do this in long-term care facilities, senior residences, palliative care units, hospice units. I've done a few in a hotel. I know someone who's done one in a camper van. I haven't personally done one on the beach yet, but we actually have a new guideline from Parks Canada. Now you're able to do this in a national park. So lots of creative ideas. I know someone who's done it in a funeral home. So interesting. So how does this work? So I'm going to briefly just explain how the process works and how the law works so that we can have that rich discussion right afterwards. So in Canada, if you want an assisted death, you need to make a request. It must be you who makes the request. There is nobody on the planet, no matter what is written on any piece of paper in any lawyer's office at all, nobody else can ever trigger or ask for an assisted death for you. Must be you. And you need to do it not verbally, but written. And every province has their own little form, but they're essentially the same. You need to fill out a request form asking for an assisted death, and that form needs to be witnessed. And it needs to be witnessed by 2 other people. They need to be adults, and they need to know what the request is for, though they don't need to agree with it. What's most important is who the witnesses cannot be. The witnesses cannot be anybody who will benefit from your death. So they cannot be anybody named in your will, and as a rule, we say no family. Because if they're going to get a mug from your kitchen cabinet, someone can argue about that. So basically, no family. Anybody who provides medical care to the patient cannot be a witness at the request. So not the doctor, not the specialist, nobody like that. Anybody who provides personal care to the patient cannot be a witness to the request. Not the home care nurse, not the lady who comes to cut the toenails. So who does that leave? Good friends, nosy neighbors, kind strangers. You can imagine that many of the people that I see have been sick for quite some time. In fact, many of them are hospitalized, haven't been socializing recently. Their worlds have shrunk. And for many of them, they don't want to share this with their nosy neighbors or even ask all their friends. And that not everybody even shares it with their family. So getting 2 witnesses can be an obstacle to access, in my opinion. There's an advocacy group in Canada called Dying with Dignity Canada. They're an amazing group. And they saw this as an access issue. And they started what they call a volunteer witness program. And so basically, I can call up the local chapter of Dying with Dignity Canada and say, I've got a lady, she's in such and such a facility, and she needs 2 witnesses. And they will send out 2 volunteer witnesses to show up at the time and date that I request. They'll get to the door, they'll make sure that person is who they say, they'll exchange ID, they won't say anything else. They'll stand there while they watch the patient sign the form. They'll then sign the form saying they saw the patient sign the form, and then they leave. I don't know if that's really a great safeguard built into the law, but there it is. We found our way. And once the request form is filled by the patient and witnessed, it's dated that day, and then a 10-day mandatory waiting period begins. And you're not supposed to have an assisted death within those 10 days. That's supposed to be meant as time for reflection. I think it's 15 days, maybe in California, in order to further discuss with family or not the decision. And it can happen anytime after that. And there are reasons why I'm allowed to reduce the 10 days in certain situations. I won't go into all the detail. But that's kind of how the request works. Once the request is done, the patient needs to see 2 independent clinicians. So not 2 clinicians that share a practice or that are married to each other, not a student and a mentor, but 2 independent clinicians, either a doctor or a nurse practitioner, that independently come up with the conclusion that they meet the eligibility criteria. And then they sign off. And if that's done and they both agree, then the patient can be told that they may have an assisted death if they wish. They don't have to, they can change their mind, but they are now empowered to do that. And I would just add, just as a slight tangent, that of all the things I do, I love that moment the most. Because when I tell a patient they are now able to have an assisted death if they want one, that's probably the most therapeutic thing I can do. Immediately their suffering goes down. Immediately they feel empowered. And it doesn't matter what happens after that. To some extent, they already feel better, they're going to do better, and if they die natural cause, they almost don't care anymore because they now know that they can do this. It's very, very satisfying to them. So I love that. We are, of course, allowed to invite other consultants in. If I feel like I need another opinion from a neurologist or psychiatrist, I can invite that as well, but it's not mandatory. And then, of course, we should be monitoring what's going on. In fact, in our legislation, we need to do that. That wasn't set up for over 2 years. Health Canada now does mandatory monitoring of every single MAID request in our country. That's only been started as of November 2018. We have not yet had our first report from them. We're not expecting it till June of 2019. But we will then be able to find out what happened, not just to the people who had a MAID death, so who they are, what their statistics, male, female, age, diagnosis, but more importantly, we'll be able to find out to who asked for a MAID death and didn't have one. What happened? Did they die while waiting? Did they lose capacity while waiting? Did they change their mind? What happened? And I think that information is super, super important. We don't have that for the first 2.5 years. We are now tracking that going forward. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Okay, so who's eligible? One more. I'm going to take 5 real minutes and tell you about this because, again, it's going to enrich our conversation. So this is where it gets interesting. If you want to be eligible, if you want to have an assisted death in Canada, you must meet 5 eligibility criteria. And here they are. They should be simple, but they're not. You need to be an adult. That means you need to be over 18. Everywhere, anywhere. It's simple fact. You can't be 17 at 0.99. You have to be 18 years of age. That may or may not change in the future, but it's pretty clear right now. Number 2, you have to be eligible for Canadian health care. That doesn't mean you need to be a Canadian citizen. That helps a lot. But it means you need to have status in Canada such that you're eligible for Canadian health care. Landed immigrant, refugee with status, guy who lives under the bridge and lost his health care card, still eligible for care. That's not a problem, right? Canadian living abroad for 20 years decides they want to go home because they need this. Actually, every Canadian citizen can move home, apply for health care, and be eligible again. So they are actually eligible for this care. American citizen who wants to pray privately? No. You cannot. That's illegal in our country. The purpose is to stop people from coming to Canada to receive this care, sometimes known as death tourism. This is never really going to change. I don't think Canada is ever going to be interested in allowing this care for anybody else, so I'm sorry. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3, the request to die has to be a voluntary request with no sense of coercion. And it's my job to help figure that out, to make sure it's not from an angry spouse who wants the house, or a greedy child who wants the house, or even something more subtle like the doctor who said, "I got nothing more for you, Mr. Smith. There's nothing more anyone can do." And then the patient trudges home and says, "Oh, I may as well die." Nope, that's not really cool either, right? So an uncoerced voluntary request for an assisted death. Let's say these things are true. Then you have 4 and 5. 4 is complicated, so I'm going to break it down for you, and I'm going to come back to 5 in a moment. The fourth, it doesn't say so much in the slide. The 4th criteria for eligibility for an assisted death in Canada says that you must have a grievous and irremediable condition. And that is different than what we used to say for the Carter decision, because it used to just mean that you had a serious illness. But our current legislation defines a grievous and irremediable condition in detail and says that in order to have one, you must meet 5 other conditions, and you must have all 5 of them, or you do not have a grievous and irremediable condition. And here they are. You need to have a serious illness. Okay, got that. And a serious illness, disease, or disability is what it says. That then puts you in what's called an advanced state of decline in capability. So that doesn't mean that the disease is advanced. It means that your ability to function has declined in an advanced way. So not a little bit, but a lot. And that's individualized to the person. It's a little bit subjective. It's a clinical decision by the physician to make. If you were a person that ran 4 international companies and spoke 8 international languages, your regular level of function is here. An advanced state of decline in capability might put you here. Many of us spend most of our life here. And for us, an advanced state of decline in capability might be here. Often it's things like what we call activities of daily living. So can you mobilize? Can you dress yourself? Can you feed yourself? Can you toilet yourself? But actually it is individualized to who you were before you had your illness. And so an advanced state of decline in capability is a clinical decision by the clinician based on who that patient was before. Okay? So a serious illness, an advanced state of decline in capability. It's the advanced state of decline that needs to be considered irreversible by any means acceptable to the patient. It's clearly outlined. So that means if you're 86 and you've got a new diagnosis of bladder cancer and your doctor says to you, "I can take that out with surgery. We'll give you a couple rounds of chemo, might do just a little drop of radiation in the future, and give me 2 years, I'll get you cured, bud." The 86-year-old might say, "Nope, don't need that, thank you." And that's okay. And as they deteriorate, as we expect they will, at some point there'll be an advanced state of decline that is irreversible by any means acceptable to the patient. So that counts. Okay? That's the 3rd one. The 4th one is that the patient is suffering in a way that they deem intolerable. So intolerable suffering, that is based on what the patient says. It's not so much up to me, this criteria. It's not for me to say what causes your suffering. It's not for me to say how much of that suffering you can endure before you decide it's intolerable. 2 identical twins with the identical diagnosis. They're both about to die. They're both on death's bed, and one of them says, "I'm ready. This is intolerable." And the other one says, "Wow, this is just terrible, but I'm expecting my great-grandchild in 2 weeks. I'm going to hang on 2 more weeks." Right? Not for me to say what's intolerable. So the patient decides basically on their intolerable suffering. And the 5th and final criteria for a grievous and irremediable condition is that the patient's natural death is in what's called the reasonably foreseeable future. And I don't know what that means either. But I spend a lot of time talking about it. So this had a lot of discussion in my country. And for the first 6 months, we didn't know what it meant. And if you didn't know what it meant, if you broke the law and didn't do it, if you didn't do it right, if I make an assessment that doesn't follow these rules, I'm liable to go to jail for 14 years. So I can tell you a lot of my colleagues said, "I don't really know if they qualify. I don't really know what that means. I don't know if they qualify. Therefore, nothing happens. No action. Inaction," right? So poorly interpreted or poorly understood law leads to inaction. Nothing was happening. So that was no good. So who should decide? Who should really decide what reasonably foreseeable means. I mean, I have an opinion clinically what reasonably foreseeable death is. The patient certainly has their own opinion. I can tell you their family has a different opinion. The administrators I work with have their own opinion. The lawyers I sometimes consult with have a very different opinion. There's a lot of opinions. So there's a lot of chaos at the beginning. But I can tell you for sure that it's not a particular time frame. So without going too far off in a tangent, I'm just going to tell you about a lady who I'm going to call AB. The AB case was in Ontario. There was a woman who was 77 who had terrible, crippling osteoarthritis, the type that put her in bed with chronic pain for many years. She was a chronic pain patient, and she wanted an assisted death. The first person she went to said, yes, you qualify. The second person said, well, you qualify in every category except for reasonably foreseeable death, because as a 77-year-old with osteoarthritis and a great heart, you could live another 7 years. I don't really think that qualifies. So she was upset, so she got a third opinion. And he said, yeah, I think you qualify. But by then the first guy said, not sure if it's true or not. I think you do, but I could be wrong, and I'm not willing to go to jail. So, nothing happened. So she wasn't happy with that, so she went to the courts for clarification. And the first thing the judge said to her was, you shouldn't be here in court. This is not a decision that the courts should make. This is not a decision that the lawyers should make. And this is not a decision that should be made around a boardroom in somebody's office. This is a clinical decision to be made by the clinician, the physician or the nurse practitioner. And that's squarely where the responsibility for determining whether they meet the criteria for reasonably foreseeable or not lives. Okay, my shoulders got wider. Got it. My job. Good. At least we've clarified that. Number two, he said to her, the other thing, he clarified that in our law, nowhere does it say anything about a time frame. It is not, reasonably foreseeable does not mean you're dying in a month, or 3 months, or 6 months, or 1 year, or 2 years, or 5 years. There's no time frame around it. We do not have legislation built on terminal illness. We do not have legislation built on a 6-month prognosis. His interpretation of the law is that it means the patient's on a trajectory towards death. Simple as that, and as complex as that. Not the same trajectory that happened on the day they were born. We're all on a trajectory towards death. Not that one. But because of their illness, their serious illness, it's changed, and now they're on a trajectory towards death. And if that's true, then they meet the criteria for reasonably foreseeable death. Well, that was eye-opening and precedent-setting across the country, and that opened the possibility for clinicians like myself to understand that we could help people with longer-term neurodegenerative disorders. Parkinson's, Huntington's, some MS patients, people who weren't necessarily going to die in a year. So this is huge repercussions. Okay. But the other thing that was happening in the meantime, that was helpful, but as soon as our law came into effect, the next day, a bunch of lawyers stood up and said, hold it, you can't put reasonably foreseeable as a criteria in our law. That's not what the Supreme Court said. That's not the Carter criteria. That is unconstitutional. That's exactly what we just fought. And so it took a long time, but those 2 cases have come to fruition, and one of them in particular, the second one on the list there, happened in Quebec. It's known as the Gladue-Truchon case. And that's been heard, and the verdict it came in this summer. And in no uncertain terms, that Supreme Court judge in Quebec said, yeah, you can't put reasonably foreseeable in the law. That's been struck down. It'll be gone in 6 months, not just in Quebec, but in the entire country. And then the provincial government had the ability to appeal that, and they chose not to. And the federal government had the ability to appeal that, and they chose not to also, which means that verdict stands. And 6 months is going to be up in March of 2020. So I expect reasonably foreseeable is going to disappear from our law, although what they put in instead is yet to be determined. So very interesting. There was another case in BC that's been adjourned because of the at the same time. Then we had a national election. And the young Trudeau Liberals, who had a majority government before, who brought in our law, C-14, campaigned on the idea that they would be relaxing our federal law to come into line with the Quebec decision. And they will be announcing their new cabinet next week on the 20th of November, and then we will see if they will live up to their campaign promise. So it should be very interesting times. I've asked Faye to bring me back down in a year. I'll give you the update of what's really going on. But in the meantime, that was just the 5 things for the grievous and irremediable condition. So we're going to go back to the 5th criteria for an assisted death in general, and that is capacity. The patient must have the capacity to make this decision. What does that mean? That they understand what they're asking for. In medicine, capacity is time and task specific. They do not need to be able to manage their bank account in order to make their own healthcare decisions. So it's helpful. What they need to be able to do is understand their illness. What's wrong? What's their diagnosis? What are their treatment options? What are the pros and cons of those treatment options, including palliative care? What is an assisted death? What does it mean if you have an assisted death? Well, you're going to die irreversibly. What happens if you don't have an assisted death? Well, you're still going to die one day, just not that way. What will your life look like if you don't have an assisted death? If you can understand all of that information and still articulate a wish to die and a request to have an assisted death, I consider that an informed consent. That is capacity. The law is clear that capacity must exist when they fill out the request form, and it must exist on the day of the death. Penny drop. You may not lose capacity and still have an assisted death. You cannot say beforehand, if I lose capacity, I still want an assisted death. Nope, can't do that. There's no such thing in Canada of an advanced request for MAID. It is not legal in our country. So you must have capacity. I'm not going to ask you to count backwards by sevens on the day of your death, but I need you to know who I am, why I'm there, that I'm going to give you some medication that's going to cause you to die irreversibly, and that you still want to do that. So I need at least that much capacity and a way for you to communicate that understanding to me. If you can't speak it, I need you to squeeze my hand, blink your eyes, use a toe board, an eye board, whatever. You need to communicate some way. If you're unrousable, I cannot help you. Okay? So those are the 5 criteria that need to happen for an assisted death. Okay, it's a lot, right? All right, what does this look like? And one more. What does this look like in practice? About 6 weeks after the law changed, I met a woman who, at the age of 61, was diagnosed with a terrible oral cancer deep in her larynx. She fought valiantly. She had surgery twice. She had multiple rounds of chemo over the years. She did well. She did poorly. She did well. She did poorly. 4 or 5 years of that. She did all the things she was supposed to do, and she did well for a while, until the point there was just simply no more treatment options to offer her. She had outstanding palliative care. She was getting palliative care treatment at home, which is where she wanted to be. She had good family support. She was well taken care of. And she said, my disease is now eating me from the inside, quite literally. I'd like to have an assisted death, please. I'd rather not go through the last couple of weeks of this. And she went to her family doctor, lucky to have one. And the family doctor said, I totally understand why you'd like to have that happen. I'd support your idea, but I have no idea how this works. Luckily, she knew of me. And she got me the information, and I went to see this woman, and I went to her home, and I spoke to her, and I spoke to her family, and I spoke to her doctor, and I spoke to her specialist, and I spoke to her ex-husband. I did all that work, I reviewed her records, I found her eligible for care. And her oncologist actually called me up and said, I would like to be the other assessor, the second clinician, which is still not that common. And he found her eligible as well, and I told her she was eligible, and she said, great, I'm going to organize the whole thing. She did not want me to do the organization. She did not want to die at home, and she did not want to die in the hospital. And she took it upon herself to call a lovely hotel in downtown Victoria on the water and very transparently said, I would like to have an assisted death in your hotel. Would that be all right? And if you think that's shocking, how about the answer? Sure. Wow. Okay, that's not consistent with all our hotels, just I'm saying. She checked in 72 hours before her scheduled death. They installed a large screen TV above the, just across from the king-size bed, scrolling family photos 24/7. She had a beautiful ocean view. At certain hours on the day, she invited friends and neighbors and family to come in at like an hour or 2-hour episode at a time. She said goodbye to everybody. She said all the things she wanted to say. Everybody got to say the things they wanted to say. And after 3 days of that, she gathered the 14 or 15 people she really wanted, and we all gathered around her king-size bed. Her children were on the bed holding her. She'd made a certain playlist of music she wanted. She was very detailed. It was lovely. And at a certain point in the playlist, actually, a very specific moment, she said to me, now, Dr. Green. Yes, ma'am. I pushed the medication, and she was dead 10 minutes later. And she died exactly how she wanted, in exactly the place she wanted, with exactly the people she wanted, with the exact music she wanted. And it was a beautiful event. And it was a huge privilege for me to be involved in that and to be invited into that space with her. An incredible family, an incredible experience. So I'm not saying that all MAID deaths in Canada look like that, but I'm telling you that some of them can and some of them do. And there's a lot of variety of what we see. And it's pretty cool. Now, when I started doing this, I have to tell you about this fabulous organization, which is coming up next on the next slide, called CAMAP, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers. Thank you. And this is a group that I had the pleasure of co-founding, and I now have the honor of wearing the title president of. And this all started because I went to a conference 1 month before the law changed, which happened to be happening in Amsterdam. Every 2 years, the World World Federation of Right to Die Societies holds an international conference on rights to die. And that year, in May 2016, it was in Amsterdam. It was a large conference. I didn't know anything about it till I got there. And I went with 2 colleagues from Victoria. And we thought we'd meet all the other Canadian doctors who were going to be stepping into this work a month later. And there were none there. So it was just 5 clinicians from Canada, all of which were in BC. And there was an ethicist from Ontario. And we all kind of met each other and got together. And when we came back to Canada, we stayed in touch. So we started asking each other questions like, where do you get the meds? And where did you get the IV tubing? And what did it feel like the very first time you did this? And what did you tell the funeral home? And everything was brand new. So we realized we were helping each other in a very, very kind of grassroots, professional, supportive way. It was immensely, immensely valuable. And we couldn't have been the only people actually doing it. So we carefully reached out to some colleagues. Nobody was public about the fact they were doing this. Myself and one other physician, Dr. Wiebe, were the only 2 that were like, hello, we're doing assisted dying. Let us know if we can help. Everybody else was very secretive about it. So we found colleagues. It was just unknown. We found colleagues. They brought a friend. He brought a friend. We all of a sudden built this network across the country of people who were doing this care. And we realized quite quickly that there was lots more questions that needed answering, and nobody was answering the questions. So we wanted to know things like, who was going to train the doctors to do this? Who was going to pay us, and what were we going to be paid? Where do we get the tubing? Where do we get the medication? Is there any sort of standardization across the country, or is it like city by city? It was just, who's going to monitor what we're doing? None of this had been answered or prepared for. Because it came from the Supreme Court, a lot of the administrators in the various provinces just kind of stood there stunned and didn't really see it. They're just like, oh, we don't really know. So nothing happened. So we decided someone needed to speak for the providers. Because if you don't support the people that do the work, no one's going to do the work, right? So we started an organization called CAMAP, and we had 3 main missions. Number 1 is to support the people that do this work, the assessors and the providers especially, and in any way that we can. We actually opened up membership of our organization to the entire MAID team, I'll call them. It's incredibly multidisciplinary, right? I can't do this without a pharmacist, a social worker, a nurse, sometimes a lawyer, an administrator, a policy wonk. There's lots of people that are involved in this work in some way. So our membership is open to all of those people, but primarily we wanted to support the assessors and providers of this work. And we do that by continuing that online community that we built. We actually have different layers of different ways of communicating, but we still have that online community going, and it's grown to hundreds of people. And I can send a question right now on my phone, and I'll get an answer within an hour. I'll have 2 or 3 answers from my colleagues across the country, and within 4 hours, I'll probably have 8 answers. I mean, it's an incredible network that's been built. So we do that. We support our members. Number 2, we educate the public and, most importantly, the healthcare community about MAID and what it is and what it isn't and how it works. It's amazing how many doctors have no idea who's eligible and who's not. And the third thing we do that we're really proud of is that we provide leadership on setting the medical standards for this care, because we do not want someone to do this poorly. We do not want some lone cowboy out there making up his own prescription and trying to do it this way and that way, because that's going to make all of us look bad. And if there's a catastrophe, it's going to set us all back. So we actually produce guidance documents for our members, and we take the most controversial things and try to make them clear. You would not be surprised to know our first guidance document was on the clinical interpretation of reasonably foreseeable. It's already way out of date. It was before the AB case even. So we do lots of things. I could spend lots of time talking to you about it, which I won't. We do all these things. We do training workshops across the country. We do case sharing webinars amongst our members to learn from each other's experiences. We do research. We organize that. We do national conferences. You could do one more. We've actually had a national conference every single year since the law. We've had our third one was last year in Vancouver. Very proud to say we had over 300 people from over 17 different disciplines. We had national partners on the podium with us. Health Canada sponsored our conference. They're very happy we're doing this work because they're probably supposed to be doing this work, and they're not. And there's no other organization that represents the people that do this work. The CMA, the Canadian Medical Association, is supposed to represent 85,000 doctors across the country. Not all of them approve of this work. Not all of them want to do this work. They can't advocate for us. So we need to advocate for ourselves. So this is what we do. If anybody's really bored, our next conference is in Toronto, May 1st and 2nd. More. I'm really particularly proud of our guidance documents. I think these have been essential to the evolution of MAID in Canada and how it's provided. There's 2 in particular I want to just mention before I open up to questions. Number one is the one that we call bringing up MAID as an end-of-life care option. I think in California, and certainly in Australia, and in many places, it's actually not allowed to bring up the topic of assisted dying to your patient unless they bring it up first. And in fact, there was a certain myth about that in Canada as well, because the wording of the law says that it's still illegal to counsel suicide. But that's a legal document, and what they mean by that is you can't go out and tell someone, hey, I think you should kill yourself. That's actually counseling to suicide, and that is illegal in our country. But in medical terms, to counsel someone is to inform them. So when I counsel someone about their end-of-life options, I'm informing them of what those options are. You may have chemotherapy. You may have withdraw your treatment. You may have palliative care. Oh, and by the way, did you know we now have this new law? There's an option called assisted dying. Is that something you'd like to know about? So I think if I'm working as a professional and I'm having a conversation at the end of someone's life and reviewing with them what their end-of-life options are, if I don't list all of the options, I'm not doing my job. If there are 4 chemotherapy regimens available and I only tell them about one, I think that's unprofessional. In fact, I think you should probably raise a complaint at the college about me if I do that. I think it's the same with end-of-life options, and our group feels very strongly about that, and we wrote a guidance document about how you can bring up the topic and when you probably should ethically and professionally do that. Not everybody agrees with our guidance document, but pretty much all our members do. And in fact, the Canadian Nursing Association, who used to have a formal guideline saying to their nurses, you may never bring up the topic of assisted dying, has now changed their guideline based on ours. So things change. So that's great. So we're very proud of that. Number 2, we also released last year a document on MAID and dementia. I'm sure someone's going to ask me about dementia. So we're going to talk about that soon. But this guidance document helps our members do assessments in patients with a dementia diagnosis. How best to do that, what they need to make sure that they're ruling in and ruling out, and helps guide them. It's a very complicated area. So we're very, very proud of those documents. Despite all this fabulous support that I think CAMAP is providing to our providers, this is an old chart, but it gets the idea across. The red line that's going up are the number of assessors, these ones are on Vancouver Island, who are now involved. So the number of GPs who are now involved in some way with this process, have been willing to do referrals, have been willing to do assessments themselves, have been willing to sign the paperwork, is growing steadily in our country and specifically in British Columbia. But despite all this change and support, the blue line at the bottom is grumbling along, and that's the amount of people that are actually willing to do the work, the provision of care. So it is growing, but it's much slower. So we need more support for sure. And if there's one thing I can leave you with, if you want to help California to move ahead with assisted dying, support the people that can do this work or that are willing to do this work. If they're working on their own, if they're feeling isolated within their hospital system, if they don't have support professionally to talk to someone about, hey, what did you do? How did you do it? Believe me, they're not going to do much of it. They're going to be very stressed. And so if you can support them in any way, you should. And I know there's a movement afoot to start a group like CAMAP in the U.S. and specifically in California, and I know that's coming to fruition in the next 6 months. And I will do my best to help them and to encourage them to do that. And if you have any way of doing that, I would encourage you to do that as well. So before I open it up to questions, I would just tell you my big conclusions. I think that it's been an absolutely remarkable 3 years in Canada and what we've been able to achieve. I think we never expected to achieve quite this much in 3 years. I think that we have a very stable system with rigorous process and rigorous guidelines and rigorous safeguards in place. There has been no charges laid against any provider for any sort of malpractice or professional misconduct. There's been no cases across the country. There have been remarkably few college complaints to our regulatory bodies about our care, which is amazing. I didn't mention so much, but we are finding our data that's just starting to come in is starting to show that people actually have very good access to good quality palliative care. It's not because they don't have access to care that they're asking to die. So that's important, and we'll be gathering that data. We've had overwhelming support by the public, by the families for this care. The national polls in Canada show 86% of the general public are in favor of assisted dying. It's huge. So we do have a vocal minority of people who are against it. Well, I don't think we're going to change everyone's mind, but they've been swamped by the amount of people who want it. So that's been helpful to me. And I mentioned before, I've been quite astounded by the relief that patients have expressed to me by having a conversation with them openly and honestly about end-of-life care. and the absolute gratitude that they express the first time I meet them, and certainly when I come to help them, and their families as well. It's been really, really an incredible journey for me personally to be involved in this work. I hope to be able to do it for longer. I've painted a beautiful picture. It is great. Obviously, we still have issues of access and process in Canada. I can also stand up here and tell you where the problems are. But I think overall, I'm very, very, very proud of what Canada has been able to do. And I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take as many questions as you are willing to sit for.
Thank you for coming down. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Great talk. Okay, great
There you
talk.
are. Thank you.
I actually have 3 questions, 1 personal and 2 general.
Okay,
The first question is, I'm actually married to a Canadian citizen.
great.
I am not Canadian. What would my access be if we should move to Canada?
Yeah, so I'm not an immigration lawyer, so I don't really have the answer. But I'm pretty sure if you're married to a Canadian, you're going to have pretty good access. You don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure you're going to get in under that wire.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. General question. You mentioned that 4% of people in Victoria. Oh, sorry. You mentioned that 4% of people in deaths in Victoria Island are now assisted deaths, correct?
Well, 7% within the city of Victoria, but yes, very high numbers on the island.
Do you correlate that with a level of education or age? Is it an older
Yeah.
population? Is it a more educated population?
So the question is, why is that going on? I mean, we've thought a lot about it. We don't have any evidence or research on it yet, but I have the answer anyways. Just ask me. No, I think it's a confluence of 4 or 5 things, to be honest, and I don't think it's rocket science. First of all, we do have a demographic that is older because people retire to the island because the weather is the secret in Canada. We have the best weather. Shh, don't tell anyone. We have a little microclimate. We get 30% less rain than Vancouver. So yes, you do have a retirement community, an older population, which is going to self-select for MAID. But more importantly, we have people from all of Western Canada that move to the island specifically to retire. These are people that have the means to do that have the desire to do that, and have the independent idea that, hey, I know how I want to spend the rest of my life. I want it to be there. I want it to be like this. That's the way I've always led my life. There's a certain independent spirit that comes with the people who make that move. So it's a certain type of person that lives on the island. We also have a particular type of person that lives on the island. We are known to be a little hippy-dippy. We are the California of Canada and all the things that come with it. Our politics on the island are progressive, to say the least. They are certainly not conservative in any way. We had an infrastructure, a healthcare, an administrator, the people that roll out and run our healthcare on the island that are particularly supportive of this care and got ready before the law changed. So they already had a structure in place with the forms in place and a way for us to do this work. They didn't wait for the law to change to do that. They were ready to go. Sue Rodriguez comes from Victoria, BC. The second case, the Carter case, it was a BC-based challenge. People in British Columbia have been talking about assisted dying for 30 years. And to top it all off, if that wasn't all enough, it's not that I live there, is that there are 3 people like myself that were living in Victoria at the time of the law change that were all willing to do the work. And that is, for a population of about 250,000 people that live in Victoria, there were 3 of us willing to do that. In all of Toronto, with 6 million people, there were 2 docs willing to work in the community. The fact that we were there and had all that support, we were fast out of the gate. So I think that we will still always be higher than the rest of the country, but I think it's not so much that we're ahead as that the rest of the country has yet to catch up. It's a bit of both. Right. So the question is, what happens if you can't write? Right? What if you don't have an arm? Right? So no. So if a patient can write, that's helpful. If the patient cannot write due to their illness, then we have the ability to use a proxy. So a very similar criteria to the witnesses I mentioned. Basically, it's a third person in the room who stands there as a proxy. The information is read to the patient who says, yes, I agree with this. And then the proxy, signs all the things for them, signs dates, and the witnesses say that they saw that happen. And it's the same with giving consent on the day of, same thing.
The other question is, did Quebec lag behind because of the influence of the French Catholic population? Because in some areas of Southern California, and particularly here in San Diego, there's a heavy
Yeah.
Catholic influence. I mean, not
So I'm going to turn that on its head. The question is about Quebec. To be honest, the Quebec actually led the way in Canada. They had a law before the rest of Canada about assisted dying because they like to call themselves a distinct society. I won't go into Quebec politics right now, but they proved it yet again by noticing that healthcare is administered provincially in our country, and they said that assisted dying is a healthcare act, and therefore they legislated assisted dying 6 months before we had a law in the rest of Canada. And that was after 2 years of research and town halls and lots of chats. So they led the way. And let me just dispel the myth. Quebec used to be heavily Catholic. People might still say so, but the truth is they kicked the church out of their lives in the 70s. Quebec is not so Catholic these days. Who's got the mic? Yes. Great question. I went to McGill. I happened to be in Montreal for medical school, which was a great experience. The question of medical school curriculum and teaching this is a large issue for CAMAP. It is an enormous nut that we don't have the manpower and resources to take on. We are a very small grassroots group of 12 volunteer boards. It's a working board. So that to change a medical school curriculum is about a 3 to 5 year process, and that's for each one. So what we've done is we've just sent our members out to knock on the door of their local. I mean, most of us are teaching physicians from the rest of our career. So I just banged on the door at UBC and I said, hey, I'm on your staff, and I think you need to teach your students about MAID. And they all looked at each other and said, well, we should probably do that. They didn't know where to put it in. It was in the ethics course. Was it in palliative care? Nope, palliative care didn't want it. Was it end of life? Maybe. It was, so a couple times a year I get to lecture to different range. It's nothing formal yet, but it's going to come. It's going to come. The students are incredibly interested. They came out of regular time for panel discussions about assisted dying. The students are interested. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. They can nod, they can point, they can write, they can squeeze, toe boards to with lots of tricks to communicate. Yeah. Who else has the mic? Right here? Yep.
Supposing that I'm diagnosed with early dementia and early Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So I find I go to Canada so I can access your laws.
Which you can't unless you're Canadian.
And I qualify. Let's suppose that I qualify for your laws. And so just before I go, I have an appointment. I'm ready to go and start the process. And I stop and I talk to my parish priest.
Yes.
And the priest says, absolutely not.
Yeah.
So, and he gives me the spiel about eternal damnation.
Sure.
And so I then go to the bishop, and the bishop
doesn't agree
is
either. What's the
much
question?
more liberal, much more sympathetic. But he doesn't say, yes, it's okay. He kind of dances around the subject and doesn't give me a direct answer. So then I go back to my doctors in Canada and say, what am I going to do? What will you do? Are you going to go ahead with the procedure? So that's what I'm asking you.
Okay, so there's two questions built into that. So let me do the first one first. It doesn't matter what anybody else on the planet says except for the patient. So if the patient doesn't want to tell their family they're applying for an assisted death, they don't have to. There's nothing in the law that says I must tell their family. In fact, I'm not allowed to tell their family without the patient's permission. Let me say this as politely as possible. I want to hear from everyone. I respect everyone's opinion. I don't really care what the parish priest has to say. I do care because it's going to impact my patient and how his care is going to be felt by him and his family. But in terms of the law, it makes no difference whatsoever. I must take my lead from the patient and the patient only. So in your story, it all depends on you. Doesn't matter what you heard along the way to my office. Now that you've mentioned dementia, let's just crack that nut while we can. So it's my opinion, and only my opinion, that our current legislation was probably not intended to deal with patients with dementia. There was 3 things that were specifically left out of our law, explicitly so. Minors, people under 18. People who want to make an advanced request for MAID. We talked about that. That's not allowed specifically. And the issue of when people have a mental health disorder as their only reason for wanting to proceed, as their sole cause of suffering, is not specifically excluded, but they can virtually never qualify because they don't meet the criteria of reasonably foreseeable death. And those 3 topics have been studied separately since the law had come in. We have reports about them from an academic institution to help inform further debate about those specific topics, which we will debate for the next 10 years. The issue of dementia was not really mentioned except for in the context of advanced requests, and it's not mentioned specifically in any way to include or exclude in our law. And I don't imagine that our legislators meant to address it. Having said that, they didn't specifically exclude it either. So the question arises, is there ever a way that someone with dementia can qualify with these criteria? And certainly the impression at the beginning stage was, well, no, you need to have capacity to make this decision, so if you lose capacity, you're out. And that's still pretty clear. But after doing this for 3 years and discussing things with people and legal scholars and other colleagues in other jurisdictions and my community of providers, and we've learned how to interpret reasonably foreseeable, we've learned how to do what we do. We started very conservatively for lots of good reasons, but now our ideas of how things are working has matured. We've not changed our criteria, but our understanding of how to do that work has matured and evolved. And I'll tell you, I met a woman 2 years ago now who came to me. It was like a pure case. She had very few physical ailments. She was in her mid-70s, and she had a purely cognitive decline. She had dementia. Very intelligent woman. And she was a lifelong supporter of the concept of dying with dignity, and she knew that she had this diagnosis. She wanted to have an assisted death. I'll save you the whole story. And I went through the process with her, and I really struggled with whether she would qualify or not. And I got to a point where I felt that she did meet all the criteria, and I'll tell you how in a minute. And I looked at them and I thought, I really think you qualify. The problem is that if I'm wrong and I've made a misinterpretation, I'm going to jail for 14 years. And I promised my husband I wouldn't go to jail. So that doesn't seem fair to put on me personally and my family to go through the ordeal of the outcome, because I'm sure if I had helped her and wrote on the form dementia, I'd get a couple people asking me questions. So I said to them, look, I'm a bit of a coward. I won't do this for you. I said, I think I'll stand up in court and I'll be your expert witness, and I will explain to the court why you should qualify. And if you want to fight this and get clarification from the courts, you can do that and I'll be on your side. If you want, you can walk away and nothing will happen. You could go to the courts, or you could maybe find someone more brave than me and maybe they'll help you. But I won't do that. And I decided not to help her. It was a very difficult decision. And they thanked me for my care, and they went off to decide what to do. And they found another assessor who decided they were eligible, and that person was helped to die, which I watched very carefully on the news. And of course, there was a large complaint, and it didn't go to law enforcement. So the way the oversight happened at the time in our province, the oversight of what was happening and whether it was done properly was temporarily in the domain of the coroner's office, simply because they had the ability to do public statistical analysis, anyways, for a bunch of reasons. But it's no longer with them. But the coroner's office didn't really know how the law worked or who did or didn't qualify. And anytime they had a question, they would go to the regulatory body of physicians. So the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC that gives me my license. And they said, well, is this okay? And so they raised a lot of questions, and this case ended up in that complaint section. And they took a long time to give their answer, and they got lots of legal help, and it took 16 months. And 16 months later, my colleague who had been doing that, who was still practicing and working and waiting for that verdict to come down, found out with a 9-page letter that she had acted professionally and had not broken any rules from a professional conduct point of view. She had documented well, she had done her job well, and she was free to go about her business. And I thought that was interesting. So that wasn't a decision about the legality. They don't have the jurisdiction to make that, but it was a really important precedent from our licensing college, who was clear to say this is not a precedent. But of course it was. And during that 16-month wait, I met a gentleman whose name is Gail Garlock, and I can say that because he very much wants his story told. And I met Gail, and he had Lewy body dementia, a horrible disease, purely dementing. He also was a very similar case. And I was watching and waiting for that other verdict. And by the time it came through and he was needing help, I felt strongly that I would have more courage and that maybe I wanted to help him. And the Gail Garlock's story is available in a radio documentary on CBC that recently came out this past month. And if you ever have the time or inclination, if you just put Gail Garlock, CBC, you'll find the radio documentary. There is an article, but if you hit listen, you'll hear Gail's wife, Barbara, speaking about the experience, and my voice as well, talking about my experience helping him to die, which I did. And I have no regrets about it. And the way that I rationalize that is that I borrowed the model from my Dutch colleagues who've been doing this. And this is what so if we use the analogy of a clock, so it's like Cinderella. At midnight, instead of turning into a pumpkin, at midnight you lose capacity, you've lost capacity. Your disease has progressed to the point that you no longer can make your own healthcare decisions. And I know that if you hit midnight, he can't do this. I'm not going to break the law. But if I meet someone early enough in their disease that they're aware of what's happening and they tell me what they want and they explain to me why and they meet all the criteria, they explain their suffering and I say, okay, maybe. And I meet them 6 months later and see if it's consistent. And I meet them 6 months later and see if it's consistent. And I watch them through their progress. And then I see them every 3 months and then every 2 months and every 1 month. We're going around the clock face and we're getting close to midnight. When you get to what I will call 10 minutes to midnight, we're really close. So he still has capacity, but I know clinically, without a crystal ball, that probably if I saw him 3 months later, probably wouldn't have capacity in my best clinical judgment. Could be off by a month, but 6 months for sure he's not. But we're getting to that place. We're 10 minutes to midnight. And if I can explain that to this person and they understand what I'm saying and consistent with their wish and consistently understanding and proving to me that they understand what we're talking about, they have a serious illness. It's put them in an advanced state of decline. Is that an advanced state of decline? Nowhere in our law does it say the advanced state of decline needs to be physical. It actually doesn't specify. I would argue that losing capacity to make your own healthcare decisions is a pretty freaking advanced state of decline in function. And if you're 10 minutes to midnight, that's pretty close. I would argue that qualifies as an advanced state of decline. It's irreversible, unfortunately. It's causing intolerable suffering, just the thought of that it's coming. And is their death reasonably foreseeable? Well, we know for people with dementing diseases, they have an average of 5 to 7 years post-diagnosis, and then they, it's very different for everyone, but, they're on a trajectory towards death. I think that they qualify. Now, some of the people in that category will lose the idea that they want to do this, or not be ready to ask to go ahead, fear that it's still too early, or, might miss that window. So it's not for everyone. But for Gail Garlock and for people like him, it can line up. The stars can line up in a way that I believe that meets all the criteria of our current law. So I helped him. And we're starting to let Canadians know that sometimes that can be possible. No. Just speak loud. Speak up. Yeah. I'll repeat your question. You can just ask.
Okay, there I can hear it too. Okay, thank you. I've had cancer, and I don't ever want to go through that hell again. Now, if tomorrow I am diagnosed with cancer again, how long? And I want to refuse all treatments. I want nothing to do it because of mental purposes, physical and financial. I want nothing to do with it. I am ready to accept it and move on. How long do I have to, or how long would I have to be in pain before I would be able to?
Nobody needs to be in pain. I would say less than 10% of my patients ask to die because of pain control. Palliative care is amazing. If you get diagnosed tomorrow, you should call palliative care the next day. I think it's what you call hospice care. Right? Everybody should be treated, should be treated well, and you shouldn't, hopefully, have to make any decisions about pain control because hopefully you will have good medical care that will take care of that for you.
Okay, and then that hospice situation would, if I'm talking Canada, I'm
Canada too.
looking at your situation. How so? That's what you would do. You would put me on hospice, even though I'm not having pain at that time when I'm diagnosed.
Well, I would, but I don't know if other.
No,
physicians-
but I mean, as far as the law and because it's to me, I don't want to go through that again.
right. So the
And but
Cana-
I want to have a good life, and when I feel it's time to go, I want to go.
Okay, so actually, what you just said is the crux of the matter. The Canadian law is based on patient suffering. And so, at the point that they meet the criteria, they have to be suffering intolerably. So, typically, I'll see someone who's got a diagnosis, let's say, of cancer. But the day they get their diagnosis, they don't qualify. They're not in an advanced state of decline in capability. They're just really
Okay.
upset about what's coming down the pipe, right? When they get, and they might have a bunch of the criteria, but the advanced state of decline in capability and intolerable suffering tend to come together. So we go through the motions of the assessment. I have kind of an open rolling assessment. I check some of the boxes, but not the other. When they call me up and say, now I'm really done. I am no longer willing to put up with what's happening in my life right now. This is intolerable to me. Check, sign, date.
And that's done.
We're good to go.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Nobody should suffer.
Okay, thank you.
I'm good. Thank you.
Does Canada Health Insurance cover the costs associated with MAID?
Entirely.
Including your fees and the cost of the medication?
I'll just say yes. Yeah, we're poorly paid, but there's no cost to the patient at all. It's a fully covered medical service in Canada, so there's no cost about the medication. There's no cost about any hospitalization that's involved. There's no cost. They theoretically cover my services. Yeah, it's excellent.
Hi. My dad used medical aid in dying here in California in June 8th. He had pancreatic cancer. When he was diagnosed 7 months previously, he was well. Other than the cancer, he was good. And then he had a rapid decline. He had made his in California, the patient needs to make a request, and then there is a 14-day waiting period before the second request, which is written and witnessed, etc. He had made his second request. He made his first request early, and the second request
Late.
when he declined, which was a week before he died. So he had a physician who attended this death. My understanding is that it's not common in our country for the physician to attend, that most physicians, and I don't know about any other states, I just know about our family's own experience, but our physician explained to us that he felt it was important that no family member be put in the unqualified, perhaps, and also unwelcome position of administering life-ending medication to their loved ones. And so he was able to mix the drugs into liquid and hold the glass while my father swallowed through a straw. And then he also had a heart monitor and a pulse ox monitor, and he was able to advise us when my father's heart stopped beating, when he became unconscious, all the steps, so that there was no question when his life was over. And I go through this long story because my question is, why do you suppose that very few physicians here attend the death compared to in Canada, where you are able to administer, not just attend?
So it's a great question. First of all, I'm sorry for your loss. Can you tell, were you there at the same time? Can you tell me how the experience was for you, just briefly?
I'll use the microphone so everybody can hear. My husband was there as well, and we, I mean, it was rotten that he died, but it was pretty cool. I mean, it
good.
was great.
Yeah.
As dying goes.
Dying goes, yeah.
It was far better than visiting him in the hospital when he had his stent put in and was diagnosed and then had to stay a couple extra days. That was pretty unpleasant.
So was he at home?
Oh yeah, he was in his armchair.
And was it peaceful?
Oh yeah.
Success. Good.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
for anybody who has not witnessed this, I will say he just took a nap in his chair and he didn't get up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I
He
mean-
got up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it was a remarkable experience and has motivated me to volunteer
Great.
for Compassion and Choices and help get this legislature passed in all the states in our country.
So I'm going to address your question. Thank you for sharing that. So before I get to the exact answer to your question, I'm going to say that in Canada, because it is provincially administered, there are actually different rules in different provinces. Where I work in British Columbia, but let me just say that of those 10,000 deaths that have happened in Canada, less than 20 have been oral self-administration. So all of them, virtually all of them, have been clinician-administered intravenous. So that's the first thing you need to know. Why is that? It goes like this. Hello, Mr. Jones. There are two options for how we can do this. And as you explain them and the pros and cons of each, Mr. Jones quickly decides that intravenous controlled by the doctor seems like his preferred method because he doesn't have to swallow something that tastes bad. He doesn't have to wait between 30 and 60 minutes for it to be effective. And he knows someone else is going to make sure that it's safe and comfortable, and I'm going to be standing next to him the whole time. And it's done in 10 minutes. And it's going to work 100%, baby. Yeah. So not a lot of people have chosen the oral route. Even though we try to be objective, if you want to be in control, I'm happy to bring you the drugs. It doesn't taste so good, but you could shoot it with your favorite liquor. Like, we try to make it objective. Less than 20. That's the first thing. In British Columbia, where I live, it is provincial law that the physician must attend even if it's oral. So we must stand by anyways. We must make sure that it happens successfully, and we have the ability to step in if after a certain amount of time it's not been successful. It would be a catastrophe for the patient, their family, and myself if they vomited halfway through the drink or 1 minute later and they woke up in a pool of that 2 days later unsuccessful. That would be a terrible medical care, and I think should not be allowed to be a possibility. So I am happy with my provincial law that says I need to stand by, and I'm happy to do that. There are other provinces where that's not the case. There are many, many more rural areas in those provinces. They want the idea that patients will have this ability to have an assisted death without having to send a doctor out to northern whatever. So there is a time and a place for that, and I see why that happens, but I think it's important that physicians are there. And in fact, the CANMAP guidelines on oral administration strongly recommend that even if it's not provincial law, that the physician attend for those very reasons until we have much more experience and blah, blah, blah. Why is it that in California, maybe physicians are choosing not to do that? I would suspect it has to do with compensation and their time. Sorry to tell you. I don't know. I don't actually know how they're compensated here, so maybe that's not true. I know that's an issue with my colleagues in certain places who don't want to attend because it takes longer. And we're not paid by the moment. We're paid a flat fee of a couple $100. So that's an issue. I think that some people might feel that it's a private moment for the family. They don't want to interfere with that. But I think there's an art to practicing in a way where you're not the center of attention and you can still be there to manage things. So I think that you can do that. Why else? I don't know. You have to ask them. But they're certainly not. Certainly not law here. And it's a great question. I think physicians should be there.
I understand you have advanced directives in Canada, as we do. This question has to do with voluntary stopping eating and drinking, which we call VSED.
You said.
And it's kind of in two parts and involves a dementia patient. If the patient, has capacity and has a good record of stating repeatedly that after they lose capacity, a doctor is to issue an order to stop eating and drinking, and B, the agent stops the patient from eating and drinking. In Canada, can the doctor or the agent proceed with VSED after capacity is lost?
So the question is about VSED, voluntary stopping and eating of drinking. So we all know, hopefully by now, that if the patient loses capacity, they cannot have a MAID death, right? Because they can't ask for it themselves. So that's clear. So the question is really, could their healthcare representative, or somehow written in their advanced care directive, could it say, I want you to stop feeding and hydrating me? So that depends on the interpretation of whether hydration and nutrition are a medical act or not. Because in an advance directive, you may certainly say, I want no, if A, B, and C are true, I want no medical treatment. I don't want my flu shot. I don't want to be ventilated. I don't want antibiotics if I get pneumonia. And if eating and drinking in your jurisdiction are known as medical care, you can opt out of that and it would be respected. Every province has their own laws around advanced care directives in Canada. So you'd have to check in each jurisdiction. So we have advanced care directives where your own wishes can be carried out, and we have healthcare representatives that you say that person will speak for me if I've lost capacity. We have both, and they can do absolutely anything. They can withdraw treatment. They can do anything at all except for aspirin-assisted death. And we haven't had the challenge yet to know. There was a case earlier before our law changed about a woman, actually a nurse, who spent most of her career helping care for dementia patients, who wrote a very clear advanced care directive that she wanted not to be fed or hydrated should she ever become demented. She, of course, became demented, and in the facility, her family said it was time to trigger that change, and the facility refused to follow that. It's a very complicated case that ended up in a very ugly situation, and that woman lived a very long time in a very bad situation. It was a horrible, horrible decision, and at the time, that judge in British Columbia deemed that the spoon feeding, 3 or 4 times she opened her mouth, that was consent, and considered it not medical care, but absolutely mandatory, that she couldn't opt out of that. So I don't know if that would still happen today. It's a good question. But we have had people in Canada, in British Columbia in particular, we had a woman who applied for an assisted death who met every criteria except for reasonably foreseeable. She was in her late 50s with multiple sclerosis and suffering, but did not have a reasonably foreseeable death. So my colleague said she did not qualify. She was unhappy, so she had capacity to choose to stop eating and drinking, which she did. And she did, perhaps not ideally. It's very difficult to do properly. 11 days into it, she was still struggling in a very ugly way. And her husband was beside himself, and he called the doctor back and said, you need to do something. My colleague went to see her and felt that she was so far along that path that it was irreversible, and felt that she was now in a position where she could say that her natural death was reasonably foreseeable, found her eligible for MAID, and provided her an assisted death. That, of course, went to the regulatory people for a big complaint and investigation. And at the end of, I don't know how many months, in another 9-page report, the college once again said to a different colleague, you acted professionally, you did not break any professional standards, you're okay. So using VSID as a way and a means to qualify for reasonably foreseeable, we have precedent for that. Hopefully we won't need that anymore, because if reasonably foreseeable leaves our law in March of 2020, no one will need to resort to do that anymore. Yeah.
Considering religion, would you share your situation with the religious person that you discussed earlier?
The religious person that I discussed earlier.
You talked about working with a monk.
Oh, yes, that was last night, yeah. So I guess what I would say is that there's often a vocal minority, often from the faithful community, against this care. And I really respect everyone's opinion about this, and it's not for everyone. I'm very big believer in choice. What works for you is for you. What works for me is for me. I don't even know what I would do in any situation. The point is that until you're in that situation, I don't think anybody knows what they would do. And I have actually helped a number of people who are deeply faithful. And I actually did assist a monk to end his life. And he found a way to, I will say, rationalize. I don't know if that's the word he would use. He felt that he didn't feel so much that I was going to kill him. He felt he was dying from his disease. His disease was going to kill him. And I was a facilitator. I wasn't the cause of the death, although you might argue that. And he also felt that whoever his higher power was merciful, and that would understand that because of his intolerable suffering, that this would be an acceptable way for him to die by his disease. And I think just the point is, until you're in the situation, you don't know what you would say. I don't ever expect the hierarchy of the church to come out and publicly admit that this is okay for any of their congregation. That's just not going to happen. But I've seen Catholic priests come to the bedside the 20 minutes before I'm administering MAID and give last rites. I've seen him I've seen all kinds of stuff, and I think from all communities, from communities that say they never will, from communities who say they will. Until you're in those positions, you just don't know.
How has hospice in Canada responded to this? I know in our state, there's only a few hospices that want to participate in any way.
Yeah, it's a great question.
In San Diego County, I should say.
Yeah, so just to clarify the terminology, in Canada, what I call palliative care is the service of the field of medicine that does supportive and comfort care at the end of life. It doesn't have to be the end of life, but it is. What we call hospice is not so much an area of medicine. Hospice is a physical building for us. It's the building in which some of the palliative care units work, and it is entirely run by them, and it is a unit that people go to. For example, Zen Hospice is a hospice, right? So the palliative care community in Canada has not embraced assisted dying. They believe strongly that their mandate is to neither hasten nor prolong life, and they interpret that quite literally. And they are not keen to have their members be involved in this care. Having said that, everyone's an individual. So if a person chooses not to be involved in assisted dying as a clinician, they certainly have the right to do that. And we respect everyone who conscientiously objects from doing this work. 100%. Totally respect and support that. But I don't respect an institution saying to to their employees, well, you can, but you can't. Like, you can't do that. Every physician has their own ability to choose, I think. And we like the term conscientious participation. So I may want to conscientiously participate in this care, where somebody else may want to conscientiously object to doing that care. So certainly the faith-based institutions have opted out and said, we will not do this. But you need to remember that in Canada, our facilities are all covered by the same tax base, right? That's universal health care. And so who pays for the lights in those facilities? My tax money does. So I don't think they're allowed to say no. You can't opt out of a legally sanctioned, fully covered medical service in Canada simply because you don't like it. You can't do that. You actually can't do that. So, you know, this hospital here and that hospital there, they both have to have an emergency department. You can't say, well, we're not going to do, you know, cardiac care because we don't like it. You just can't do that. Yeah. So what's happened though is, so I'm just waiting for a court case. There's going to be a challenge in Canada about this very issue. It hasn't happened yet. I'm pretty sure it will be successfully challenged. But in the meantime, there is a lot of people that are living in those facilities or being cared for in, let's say, faith-based facilities or even non-faith-based facilities that have opted out of this care that are needing to transfer out. So there's some horrific stories about people who have lived in facilities for 5-6 years because of their disease. They want to have an assisted death. They qualify, but they can't be assessed on the grounds of that facility. They need to go outside the parking lot. So they meet in a cafe to have a conversation with the doctor. There's documented cases of people sitting in a bus shelter signing their MAID forms. That's repugnant. And what's worse than that is that they can't have their care, they can't have their end-of-life care in that facility, so they're being forced to transfer out to a different place. And that might sound okay as an option. These people are suffering intolerably at the end of life. To put them in the back of an ambulance and truck down the highway down to a clinic who will accept them is a cruel, cruel event. It often requires anesthetic and often makes them lose their capacity. I mean, it's crazy.
Before too many people get away, I want to thank her again for a wonderful presentation and for the work she's done so much.